I never imagined I'd be the type of guy who would snoop through his wife's phone. But here I was, sitting on the edge of our bed, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the messages on her screen. It all started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. Jenny and I had been married for nearly 20 years, and although things hadn't been perfect, I thought we were solid. Sure, the spark had dimmed over time, but what long marriage didn't face its challenges? Lately, though, something had been off. Jenny had been distant, more absorbed in her phone than in our conversations. She'd laugh at something on her screen and then quickly tuck it away when I walked into the room. I'd tried to brush it off, chalking it up to work stress or her needing some space, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then last night, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Out of curiosity, I glanced at the screen, and there it was, some message from a contact saved under an innocuous name, Work Buddy. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for the content that popped up in the preview. I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last time was amazing. My heart skipped a beat. I had to sit down, the reality of what I'd seen hitting me like a cold splash of water. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe an inside joke I didn't understand, or maybe it was meant for someone else. But deep down, I knew I had to dig deeper. That night, after Jenny fell asleep, I carefully lifted her phone again, praying she hadn't set up some new passcode. She hadn't. I hesitated for a second, then opened her messaging app. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit, full of details about their last meeting and plans for their next. I felt my stomach churn as I read the words, imagining her with this other man, doing things we hadn't done in months. What really stung was that this work buddy wasn't just a fling, they'd been at it for a while, judging by the history in the chat. The thought of my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, sneaking around with someone else made me sick to my core. But there was something more unsettling about the whole thing, something familiar in the way they talked, as if I should know who this guy was. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was just a phase, a mistake she'd soon regret. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to know more, to get to the bottom of this before confronting her. My mind was racing, filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and disbelief. How could she do this to me? To us? To our family? The next day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I went through the motions at work, my mind fixated on those messages. I kept replaying the words in my head, the way she'd signed off with a kiss emoji. Every time I thought about it, I felt a burning sensation in my chest. This wasn't just some random guy. She cared about him, maybe even loved him. But who was he? By the time I got home that evening, I was on autopilot. Jenny was in the kitchen, smiling as if nothing had changed, as if our entire life hadn't just been shattered in my mind. I forced a smile back, my stomach knotting with the weight of what I knew. She asked me how my day was, and I mumbled something about work being busy. Inside, I was screaming. That night, as she slept beside me, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her yet, I needed more proof. If she had been sneaky enough to carry on this affair without me noticing, then I needed to be just as sneaky. That's when I decided to install a tracking app on her phone. It wasn't difficult, I'd dabbled in tech enough to know my way around her devices. The app was discreet, wouldn't show up on any of her menus, and would give me access to her location, messages, and even her calls. As I finished setting it up, I felt a pang of guilt. What had our marriage come to? Spying on my own wife felt wrong on so many levels, but I had to know the truth. I couldn't confront her with just suspicion, I needed concrete evidence. Over the next few days, I monitored her every move. Her patterns were predictable: work, gym, the occasional coffee with friends. But there were gaps, times when she wasn't where she said she'd be. She started leaving the house earlier and coming back later, always with a vague excuse about errands or extra meetings. The messages continued, too, every day, more of the same sickening sweetness between her and this guy. Then, it hit me. I could ask around, subtly, about who she was spending time with at work. Maybe one of her coworkers would slip up, or I'd catch them together. But every time I considered that, I pulled back. I didn't want to tip her off. I needed her to feel secure, to keep slipping up until I had enough to confront her with everything I'd found. It was a miserable time. I couldn't look at her without feeling a mix of love and rage. How could someone I loved so deeply betray me like this? My brother, Tom, noticed something was off when we grabbed beers together one night. He asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. How do you say, "I think my wife is cheating on me," without falling apart? Instead, I lied, said I was just stressed at work. But the lie felt like another betrayal, this time to myself. I wasn't okay, and pretending otherwise was killing me inside. As the days went by, I became more obsessed with uncovering the truth. The late-night message checks, the tracking, the mental cataloging of her every move, I was consumed by it. My mind raced with questions. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I seen the signs? And then, one night, I got my answer. I was scrolling through her phone again while she slept when I saw a new message thread. The contact was saved as "Buddy," and something about it caught my eye. It wasn't like the others. The tone was different, more casual, more familiar. As I read through the messages, a cold realization dawned on me. The way they joked, the inside references, I knew this person. This wasn't some random guy from her office. It was someone much closer. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. There, in black and white, was the truth I'd been dreading. Jenny's lover wasn't just some anonymous work buddy. He was someone I knew well, someone I trusted. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I put her phone down, my mind spinning. How could she do this? How could he do this? This was worse than anything I could have imagined. The betrayal wasn't just from her, it was from someone I'd never expected. My own brother. I didn't sleep that night. As the reality sank in, so did the rage. This wasn't just an affair, it was a knife in my back, twisted by the two people I trusted most in the world. But I wasn't going to confront them yet. No, I needed more. This was just the beginning. The fire of revenge started to burn within me. I was going to make them both pay. I continued to monitor her phone, her texts, her location, waiting for the moment when I could catch them together. The messages between them became more frequent, more explicit, and every time I read them, I felt my blood boil. They were planning something, a weekend getaway, just the two of them. The thought of them spending time together, laughing, touching, making love, it made me sick to my stomach. But it was also the perfect opportunity. I needed to catch them in the act, to confront them both and let the truth explode in their faces. The day finally came when she told me she was going on a business trip. She tried to act casual, like this was just another routine work event, but I could see the excitement in her eyes, the way she couldn't hide that little smile. It made me want to scream at her, to throw everything I knew right in her face, but I held back. I needed this to play out just right. I watched her pack her suitcase, carefully folding clothes that I knew would end up on some hotel floor. She kissed me goodbye with a sickening sweetness, telling me she'd miss me and that she'd be back in a few days. The lies slipped off her tongue so easily, like she'd been doing this for years. Maybe she had. As soon as she left, I sprang into action. I knew exactly where she was going, thanks to the tracking app, and I booked myself a room at the same hotel under a different name. The drive there felt like an eternity, every mile bringing me closer to the moment I'd confront them. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I replayed the scenarios in my head over and over again, how I'd catch them, how I'd unleash my fury, how I'd make them pay for what they'd done to me. When I finally arrived, I checked in without any issues. My room was on the same floor as theirs, just a few doors down. It was almost too easy. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the clock, waiting. Every second felt like an hour. I could feel the tension in my muscles, my whole body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional ding of the elevator down the hall. Then, I got the notification on my phone. They'd arrived. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest as I opened the tracking app. They were right there, just a few doors away. The app also allowed me to tap into the microphone on her phone, and what I heard made my skin crawl. They were laughing, whispering sweet nothings to each other, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. I waited, biding my time, letting them get comfortable. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, but I knew that patience was key. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I grabbed the keycard to their room, one I'd managed to get earlier by slipping the maid a generous tip. My mind was a blur of anger and adrenaline as I marched down the hallway, my steps heavy, each one pounding like a drum in my head. I paused outside their door, my hand trembling as I slid the card into the slot. The lock clicked open, and I pushed the door slowly, stepping into the dimly lit room. The sight that greeted me was worse than I could have imagined. There they were, tangled in the sheets, her body pressed against his, both of them completely oblivious to my presence. The sounds of their passion filled the room, their moans of pleasure mixing with the blood rushing in my ears. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it all. This was my wife, the woman I had loved and trusted, now betraying me in the most intimate way possible, with my own brother no less. My vision blurred with red as the reality of the situation crashed down on me. The rage that had been simmering for days finally erupted. What the fuck is going on here? I bellowed, my voice a raw, guttural snarl that shattered their moment of ecstasy. They both froze, their eyes snapping open as they realized what was happening. Jenny's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock and terror. My brother, Tom, was just as stunned, his mouth hanging open as he scrambled to cover himself with the sheets. Jenny started, but I wasn't interested in hearing any of her bullshit excuses. Don't you fucking dare say a word. I spat, my voice shaking with fury as I stormed towards the bed. I grabbed Tom by the collar, yanking him off the bed with all the strength I could muster. He stumbled, his legs tangling in the sheets as he tried to regain his footing. David, listen, it's not what it looks like, he stammered, his voice trembling with fear. But his words only fueled the fire inside me. Not what it looks like? I growled, my fist connecting with his jaw in a single, brutal punch that sent him crashing to the floor. You think I'm fucking blind? I could feel the bones in my hand crunch against his face, but the pain was nothing compared to the searing hatred burning through my veins. He tried to scramble away, but I was on him in an instant, my fists raining down on him in a flurry of blows. Each punch was a release of all the anger, the hurt, the betrayal that had been building inside me for days, weeks, maybe even years. I didn't hold back, I wanted him to feel every ounce of pain that I was feeling, to suffer for what he had done. Jenny screamed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that only made me hit harder. Stop it. David, stop, she shrieked, trying to pull me off him, but I shoved her away, my focus entirely on the man who had ruined my life. I could hear her crying, begging me to stop, but her words were drowned out by the pounding of blood in my ears, the pure, unadulterated rage that had taken over. Tom's face was a mess of blood and bruises, his eyes swollen shut, his lips split and bleeding. He was barely conscious, his body limp beneath me, but I wasn't done yet. I grabbed him by the throat, squeezing until his gasps for air became desperate. How could you do this to me? I hissed, my face inches from his. You're my fucking brother. He choked out something that might have been an apology, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I released him, shoving him to the ground as I stood up, breathing heavily, my chest heaving with exertion. Jenny had retreated to the corner of the room, clutching the sheets to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. I turned to her, the rage still boiling inside me, but now there was something else, disgust. Disgust at her, at what she had done, at how she had destroyed everything we'd built together. You're fucking pathetic, I spat, my voice cold and venomous. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? She tried to speak, but all that came out were sobs, her body shaking with fear and guilt. I didn't care. I was done with her. Done with both of them. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me, leaving them to wallow in the mess they'd made. I didn't look back. As I walked down the hallway, I could still hear her crying, but it only made me walk faster. I needed to get out of there, to get away from the stench of betrayal that clung to me like a bad dream. My hands were shaking, my knuckles throbbing from the beating I'd given Tom, but I didn't care. It felt good. They deserved every bit of pain I'd inflicted on them, and more. When I reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my whole body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. I stared at my blood-stained hands, the reality of it all slowly sinking in. I'd caught them. I'd seen it with my own eyes. And I'd made them pay. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new emotion took its place: emptiness. A hollow, aching void that settled in my chest as I realized what I'd lost. My wife. My brother. My family. They were gone, and there was no getting them back. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. The rage was gone, but the pain remained, a dull, throbbing ache that refused to go away. I knew that this was just the beginning. The confrontation had happened, but the fallout was still to come. I was going to have to face Jenny again, to deal with the aftermath of what I'd done. But for now, I just needed to get away, to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I started the car and drove away, leaving the hotel, the scene of the crime. I drove aimlessly for hours, the events of that night playing on a loop in my mind. Every time I blinked, I saw them again, Jenny and Tom, tangled together in those hotel sheets, their expressions shifting from pleasure to horror the moment they saw me. My knuckles throbbed, stained with Tom's blood, a reminder of the violence that had erupted from my pain. But the satisfaction I'd felt in that moment had quickly given way to something darker, something emptier. I ended up in a parking lot of some no-name diner on the outskirts of town. I stared at the neon sign flickering above the entrance, the buzzing of the lights matching the ringing in my ears. My phone had been silent the whole time, no calls, no texts from Jenny. She was probably still back at the hotel, tending to Tom, trying to make sense of the chaos I'd left behind. Or maybe she was too scared to reach out, afraid of what I'd say or do next. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was what I was going to do about it. My marriage was over. That much was clear. There was no coming back from this. But the thought of confronting Jenny, of going back to the house where we had lived together for so many years, felt like a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. Not yet. As I sat there, my mind racing, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I'd have to face her, to demand answers, to decide what was going to happen next. But how do you even begin to have a conversation like that? How do you look someone in the eye, someone you once loved, and ask them why they destroyed everything? After what felt like an eternity, I finally started the car again, my body moving on autopilot as I made my way back home. The streets were eerily quiet, the world still and dark as if it knew something terrible had happened and was holding its breath. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the porch light, a beacon that felt both welcoming and mocking at the same time. I sat there for a moment, staring at the front door, half expecting Jenny to come out, to rush towards me with apologies and excuses. But the door remained shut, the house as silent as the grave. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to come, and finally, I got out of the car. The front door creaked as I opened it, the familiar sound sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the house was just as I'd left it, but it felt different, tainted. The pictures on the walls, the furniture we'd picked out together, all of it felt like a lie, a cruel joke that had been played on me for years. I dropped my keys on the table by the door and made my way to the living room, where I found Jenny sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of fear and guilt. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was thick, heavy with all the words we weren't saying. I could see she was trembling, her hands clasped together in her lap as if she was trying to hold herself together. But it was her eyes that caught my attention, those familiar eyes that once held so much love, now filled with a terror that I'd never seen before. "David," she began, her voice small and shaky. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" I interrupted, my voice cold and sharp. I could feel the anger rising again, the same fury that had driven me to beat my own brother half to death. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say to me?" She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the pain that I was feeling, to understand just how deeply she'd cut me. I took a step closer, my fists clenching at my sides as I fought to keep control. I couldn't lose it again, not like I had with Tom. But God, how I wanted to. "David, please," she said, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Never wanted to hurt me?" I spat the words out, my anger boiling over. "You've been fucking my brother, Jenny. Do you even understand what that means? Do you even care?" She sobbed, burying her face in her hands, but I wasn't about to let her hide. I grabbed her wrists, yanking her hands away from her face so she had to look at me, had to see the man she'd betrayed. "Look at me!" I shouted, my voice trembling with rage. "Look at me and tell me why. Tell me why you did this." Her body shook with sobs, her breath hitching as she tried to speak. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know why." "Bullshit!" I shouted, my grip tightening on her wrists. "You know exactly why. You're just too much of a coward to admit it." She cried harder, her whole body trembling as she tried to pull away, but I wouldn't let her. I needed answers. I needed her to say it, to acknowledge what she'd done. "You think you can just fuck around with my brother and get away with it?" I snarled, leaning in closer, my face inches from hers. "You think you can just lie to me, betray me, and I'll just walk away?" "I'm sorry," she kept repeating, over and over again, as if those words could somehow erase everything she'd done. But they didn't. They only fueled the fire burning inside me. "Why him?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Why my brother?" Her sobs grew louder, her tears soaking her face as she struggled to speak. It just happened," she choked out. "I was lonely, and he was there, and I was weak, and I'm so sorry, David. I'm so sorry." "Weak?" I echoed, my voice laced with venom. "You think being weak is an excuse? You think that justifies what you've done?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. No, I know it doesn't. I know I fucked everything up. But I love you, David. I still love you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the absurdity of them leaving me speechless for a moment. Love? Was she seriously talking about love now? After everything she'd done? I let go of her wrists, shoving her away from me in disgust. "You call this love?" I said, my voice filled with disbelief. "You're pathetic, Jenny. You're a fucking joke." She reached out for me, her eyes pleading, but I took a step back, putting distance between us. I couldn't stand to be near her, to look at her, to smell the scent of my brother on her skin. "Please, David," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please don't leave. We can fix this. We can get through this." "Fix this?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "There's nothing left to fix, Jenny. You destroyed it all." She collapsed onto the couch, her body racked with sobs, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. This was her mess. This was the bed she'd made, and now she had to lie in it. "I'm filing for divorce," I said flatly, the words leaving my mouth with a finality that shocked even me. "I'm done. I'm done with you, with this, with all of it." "No," she screamed, leaping to her feet, her face a mask of desperation. "No, David, please. Don't do this. I love you. I'll do anything, just please don't leave me." She tried to grab me, to hold on to me, but I pushed her away, my eyes blazing with anger and disgust. "It's too late for that, Jenny. It's too fucking late." I turned away from her, walking out of the living room, her cries echoing behind me. I couldn't stay there, couldn't be in the same house as her, not after what had happened. I needed to get out, to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. As I reached the front door, she followed me, her voice frantic and hysterical. "David, please. Don't leave. We can fix this. We can make it right." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and turned to face her one last time. "There's nothing to fix, Jenny. You killed everything that was good between us the moment you decided to spread your legs for Tom." Her face crumpled at my words, but I didn't care. I was done being the nice guy, done being the forgiving husband. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I could still hear her crying inside, but I didn't look back. I just kept walking, leaving her and the ruins of our marriage behind. As I sat in my car, the engine idling in the quiet darkness, a cold, calculated rage began to settle over me. The pain, the betrayal, the raw emotion, it all started to fade, replaced by a single, burning focus: revenge. Jenny had destroyed our marriage, shattered my trust, and humiliated me in the worst way possible. She thought she could just sob and plead her way out of this? No. She had to learn that actions have consequences, and I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the agony she'd inflicted on me. Divorce could wait. Right now, all I wanted was to make her pay. I turned off the car, my mind already racing with ideas. I knew Jenny well, better than anyone else. I knew her weaknesses, her fears, the things that mattered most to her. And I was going to use all of it against her. The first step was making her life as miserable as she'd made mine. No more Mr. Nice Guy, no more being the supportive, understanding husband. She was about to find out what it was like to be on the receiving end of betrayal. I sat there for a while, my mind spinning with dark, vengeful thoughts, until a plan began to form. Slowly, methodically, I got out of the car and walked back into the house, my movements deliberate and measured. The house was quiet now. Jenny had finally stopped crying, probably exhausted from the emotional storm she'd unleashed earlier. But I wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. The first thing I did was head to the bedroom, where I found her curled up on the bed, still sniffling, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up as I entered, hope flickering in her tear-streaked face, but I didn't say a word. I simply walked over to the closet and began pulling out her clothes, yanking them off hangers, and throwing them onto the floor in a messy heap. "David, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice weak and uncertain. I ignored her, my actions fueled by a cold, relentless fury. I grabbed her shoes, her bags, anything that was hers, and tossed them into the growing pile on the floor. Her confusion quickly turned to panic as she realized what was happening. "David, stop! What are you doing?" she cried, scrambling off the bed and trying to stop me, but I shoved her away, my eyes blazing with a hatred that made her recoil in fear. "You think you can just betray me and get away with it?" I snarled, my voice low and dangerous. "You think you can fuck my brother and then cry your way out of it? You've got another thing coming, Jenny." I grabbed the pile of her belongings and marched out of the bedroom, heading straight for the garage. I could hear her following me, her footsteps frantic as she tried to keep up. I opened the garage door and threw everything into the trunk of her car, slamming it shut with a force that made the entire vehicle shake. "David, please. Stop," she begged, grabbing my arm, but I ripped it out of her grasp, turning to face her with a look that made her take a step back. "Get in the car," I ordered, my voice as cold as ice. "David, no, please. Get in the car." My tone left no room for argument. Trembling, she obeyed, slipping into the driver's seat as tears continued to stream down her face. I slammed the door shut and walked around to the passenger side, getting in beside her. The silence in the car was suffocating as I glared at her, my anger simmering just below the surface. "Drive," I commanded. She hesitated, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Where are we going?" "Just drive," I snapped. "You'll find out soon enough." She started the car, her movements jerky and unsure, and pulled out of the driveway. I directed her out of town, towards the more isolated areas, where I knew we wouldn't be disturbed. The drive was tense, the only sound the hum of the engine and her occasional sniffles. I kept my gaze fixed on her, watching her every move, making sure she understood that there was no escape from what was coming. After about 20 minutes, I told her to turn onto a narrow, deserted road that led into the woods. It was a place we used to go when we first started dating, a secluded spot where we could be alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. What had once been a place of love and intimacy was now the setting for her punishment. When we reached the end of the road, where the trees closed in around us, I ordered her to stop. The car idled in the darkness, the headlights cutting through the thick shadows, but all they illuminated was the dense forest ahead. I turned to her, my expression unreadable, as I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a set of keys. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door and pulling her out with more force than necessary. She stumbled, but I didn't care. I shoved the keys into her hand and pointed to the trunk. "Open it," I ordered. She hesitated, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "David, please, don't do this." "Open the fucking trunk, Jenny," I growled, my patience wearing thin. With trembling hands, she did as she was told. The trunk popped open, revealing the pile of her belongings that I'd thrown in earlier. I grabbed the bags and clothes, dumping them onto the ground in front of the car. The sight of her life, her possessions, strewn across the dirt and leaves, seemed to break something inside her. "David, please, let's just go home," she begged, falling to her knees beside the pile, her hands grasping at the clothes as if trying to gather them back together. "We can fix this, we can." "We can what, Jenny?" I snapped, my voice dripping with venom. "Pretend like nothing happened? Pretend like you didn't betray me in the worst possible way? You think I'm just going to let this go? You think I'm just going to forgive you?" She sobbed, her fingers clinging to a dress she loved, one I had bought her for our anniversary years ago. "I'm so sorry, David. I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make it right, please." "Anything?" I sneered, my eyes narrowing as I looked down at her. "You think you can just say sorry and make everything okay? You think you can undo the damage you've done? No, Jenny. There's no going back from this. You've ruined everything." I watched her for a moment, her body racked with sobs, and then a cold, cruel idea came to me. She wanted to fix this? Fine. She could start by showing me just how low she was willing to go. "Strip," I commanded, my voice cutting through the night like a blade. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "What?" "Strip," I repeated, my tone leaving no room for argument. "If you're really sorry, if you really want to make this right, then show me. Prove to me that you'll do anything." Her face crumpled, her sobs growing louder, but she didn't move. I stepped closer, towering over her, my expression cold and unforgiving. "Do it, Jenny. Or I swear to God, you'll regret it." She hesitated for a moment, her breath hitching as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Slowly, shakily, she began to unbutton her shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as tears streamed down her face. She kept her eyes downcast, too ashamed to look at me as she stripped off her clothes, piece by piece, until she was kneeling in the dirt, naked and vulnerable. I stared at her, my heart pounding with a sick satisfaction as I watched her humiliation. This was what she deserved. This was the price she had to pay for her betrayal. But as I looked at her, trembling and broken, something inside me twisted. A part of me, deep down, wanted to feel pity, to forgive her, but the rage, the hurt, it was too much. I couldn't let go of it. I couldn't let her off that easily. "Get up," I ordered, my voice cold. She obeyed, her body shaking as she rose to her feet, her arms wrapping around herself in a futile attempt to cover her nakedness. "Now walk," I said, pointing towards the dark, ominous forest ahead. "David, please," she whimpered, but I wasn't having it. "Walk!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. She flinched and then began to walk, her bare feet stumbling over the rough ground as she moved deeper into the woods. I followed her, my eyes never leaving her, making sure she didn't try to run. She kept glancing back at me, her eyes pleading, but I ignored her. I wasn't done with her yet. When we reached a small clearing, I stopped her. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the scene. It was perfect. "Kneel," I commanded, and she sank to the ground, her body trembling with fear and cold. Jenny knelt in the clearing, her body shaking with fear and the cold night air. Her sobs were the only sound in the otherwise silent woods, each one grating against my nerves. I could feel the power surging through me, the control I had over her, and it was intoxicating. But even as I stood there, watching her crumble, the anger in me refused to be quenched. The image of her and Tom, my brother, flashed in my mind, reigniting the fury that had driven me here in the first place. Jenny wasn't the only one who had to pay. My brother, my own flesh and blood, had betrayed me in the most unforgivable way. He thought he could sleep with my wife and walk away unscathed? He was wrong. Dead wrong. Leaving Jenny to shiver in the cold, I turned and walked back to the car. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. I knew what I needed to do next, and I needed to do it alone. As I reached the car, I grabbed my phone from the dashboard, my mind already formulating the next part of my plan. Tom was still at the hotel, licking his wounds after the beating I'd given him, and I intended to finish what I started. I got into the car and slammed the door shut, the engine roaring to life as I sped out of the woods and back onto the main road. The drive to the hotel felt different this time, not like the frantic, chaotic rush it had been before. This time, I was calm, focused. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and there was no hesitation, no second guessing. When I pulled into the hotel parking lot, it was eerily quiet, the only light coming from the dim bulbs above the entrance. I parked at the far end of the lot, out of view from the main entrance, and took a moment to steady myself. The adrenaline was starting to kick in again, but this time, I was in control of it. This wasn't going to be like last time. I wasn't going to let my emotions get the best of me. I was going to make sure Tom felt every ounce of pain he had caused me. I got out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin, and made my way to the side entrance. The hotel was mostly deserted at this hour, which worked in my favor. I slipped inside, moving silently down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Tom's room was on the second floor, just a few doors down from where Jenny and I had stayed the last time we were here. The thought of her in that bed with him made my blood boil, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about Jenny anymore. This was about making Tom pay. When I reached his door, I hesitated for just a moment, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Then, without knocking, I slid the keycard into the lock and pushed the door open. Tom was lying on the bed, his face still swollen and bruised from our earlier encounter. He looked up in shock as I entered, his eyes widening in fear. "David, what the hell?" he started, but I was on him before he could finish. I grabbed him by the throat, slamming him back against the headboard with enough force to make the whole bed rattle. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at mine as I squeezed tighter, my face inches from his. "Did you really think I'd let you get away with this?" I hissed, my voice low and deadly. "Did you really think you could fuck my wife and walk away?" "David, please," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Shut the fuck up." I snarled, tightening my grip until his face turned red, his eyes bulging from the pressure. I wanted to see the fear in his eyes, to know that he understood just how badly he'd fucked up. But I wasn't here to kill him. No, death would be too easy, too merciful. I wanted him to suffer, to feel the weight of his betrayal every day for the rest of his miserable life. I released him suddenly, letting him collapse onto the bed, gasping for air. He clutched his throat, coughing and wheezing as he tried to catch his breath. I stood over him, my chest heaving with anger, watching as he struggled to pull himself together. "You're going to wish you were dead by the time I'm done with you," I said coldly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You took everything from me, and now I'm going to take everything from you." I grabbed him by the hair, yanking him off the bed and dragging him across the room. He stumbled, barely able to stay on his feet as I shoved him towards the small desk in the corner. On it was his laptop, still open from where he'd been mindlessly scrolling through social media, probably trying to distract himself from the pain in his face. "You like fucking around with other people's wives, don't you, Tom?" I sneered, shoving him down into the chair. "You think you're some kind of hotshot? A real ladies' man? Well, let's see how you like it when everyone knows what kind of piece of shit you really are." I opened the laptop, navigating quickly to his email. He tried to protest, but one look from me silenced him. His hands shook as he watched me start typing, his bloodshot eyes darting between the screen and my face. I drafted an email to his boss, copying several key colleagues, detailing his sordid affair with Jenny. I included the explicit messages they'd sent each other, attaching screenshots I'd taken from Jenny's phone earlier. I knew exactly what buttons to push, what to say to destroy his reputation, to make sure he lost everything. Tom was a respected man at work, well-liked and trusted. That was about to change. "You're going to lose your job, your friends, your entire fucking life," I said as I hit send, watching the email disappear into cyberspace, carrying with it the poison that would ruin him. "And when you do, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you did this to yourself." He was crying now, the tears mingling with the blood still oozing from the cuts on his face. He looked pathetic, a broken man who had once been my brother. I felt nothing for him now. No pity, no remorse. Just cold, calculated satisfaction. "Please, David," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'll do anything." "Anything?" I repeated, my eyes narrowing as I considered his words. "You've already done enough, Tom." I grabbed his phone off the desk and scrolled through his contacts until I found what I was looking for, his girlfriend's number. The woman he had been seeing for the past year, the one he was planning to propose to. She had no idea what kind of man she was really with, but she was about to find out. I dialed her number and held the phone up to his ear, my hand gripping the back of his neck as I forced him to speak. "Tell her what you've been doing," I ordered, my voice cold and unyielding. He hesitated, his breath hitching in his throat, but a squeeze on the back of his neck made him obey. The phone rang once, twice, and then she picked up. "Tom," her voice was soft, concerned. "Is everything okay?" "Sarah." He stammered, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I've been cheating on you." There was silence on the other end, a stunned, disbelieving silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "I've been cheating on you, with my brother's wife," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." I yanked the phone away from him, cutting off the call and tossing it onto the bed. The damage was done. His relationship, his job, his reputation, everything he had was crumbling around him, just like he had crumbled mine. I leaned in close, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You deserve every bit of this, Tom. And I hope it haunts you for the rest of your life." He didn't say anything, just sat there, broken and defeated, his head hanging low. The satisfaction I felt was hollow, a fleeting sense of victory that did nothing to ease the pain in my chest. But it was done. I had made him pay. I straightened up, turning away from him, and walked out of the room without another word. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the heat of the rage that had consumed me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the weight of what I'd done, of everything that had happened, pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't look back as I got into my car and drove away. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. I had taken my revenge, but it hadn't brought me the peace I'd hoped for. All I felt was emptiness, a void that nothing could fill. I sat in the car, my hand still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dark, silent house in front of me. The adrenaline from the night's events was wearing off, leaving me with nothing but a heavy, suffocating emptiness. I had taken my revenge, but instead of feeling victorious, I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving behind nothing but a gaping wound. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself to get out of the car. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I made my way to the front door. The house loomed ahead, a place that had once been a sanctuary, now a monument to everything I had lost. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob as I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for what I knew was waiting inside. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the darkened hallway. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else, fear, maybe, or regret. I wasn't sure. I walked through the house, each step echoing in the silence, until I reached the living room. Jenny was there, curled up on the couch, her body wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of dread and hope, as if she was praying that somehow, everything could be undone, that we could go back to the way things were before. But there was no going back. Not now. Not ever. David, she whispered, her voice trembling. Where did you go? I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I stood there, looking at her, taking in the sight of the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world. The woman who had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. The woman who was now just a stranger to me. I went to see Tom, I finally said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. She flinched at the mention of his name, her eyes widening in fear. What did you do? I made sure he understood what happens when you betray your own blood, I replied, my tone cold, almost detached. And I made sure he'll never forget it. Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket tightly, as if it could protect her from the storm that was still brewing inside me. David, please. I know what I did was unforgivable, but... Unforgivable? I cut her off, my voice sharp. Do you even understand the meaning of that word, Jenny? What you did wasn't just unforgivable. It was fucking unforgivable. She winced at the venom in my words, her eyes filling with tears again. I know. I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything, but I love you, David. I've always loved you. Love? I spat, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. You call this love? You destroyed our marriage, you betrayed me with my own brother, and you think you can still talk about love? She sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was lonely, I was confused, and Tom, he was there, and I made a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. This wasn't just a mistake, Jenny. This was a fucking choice. You chose to lie to me. You chose to betray me. You chose to fuck my brother. She cried harder, her body trembling as the reality of what she'd done seemed to finally sink in. But I wasn't done. I wasn't going to let her off that easily. She needed to understand just how deeply she had cut me, just how much she had destroyed. Do you know what the worst part is? I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. The worst part is that I still love you. After everything you've done, after all the lies and the betrayal. I still fucking love you. And I hate myself for it. Her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of shock and guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't give her the chance. But that love, it's not enough anymore, I continued, my voice trembling with the weight of my emotions. It can't fix this. It can't undo the damage you've done. We're beyond that now, Jenny. We're beyond saving. She shook her head, her eyes pleading with me, as if she could somehow convince me otherwise. No, David, please, we can fix this, we can go to counseling, we can. Counseling? I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. Do you really think a fucking therapist can fix what you've broken? This isn't something you can just talk through, Jenny. You destroyed our marriage the moment you decided to cheat on me. You killed whatever future we had. Her face crumpled, and she let out a strangled cry, the sound tearing through the room like a knife. Please, please don't say that. I can't lose you, David. I can't. The desperation in her voice, the raw pain, I knew it was real. I knew she was hurting, just as much as I was, but it didn't change anything. It didn't erase what she had done. You already lost me, I said quietly, the finality of the words settling over us like a shroud. The moment you let him into our bed, you lost me. She let out another sob, collapsing onto the couch, her body shaking with grief. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness where my heart used to be. I wanted to feel something, anything, but all I felt was numb. Finally, I turned away, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. I'm leaving, I said, my voice emotionless. I need to get out of here. David, no, please, she begged, scrambling off the couch and rushing towards me. She grabbed my arm, trying to stop me, but I shook her off, my patience wearing thin. Don't touch me, I snapped, my voice sharp enough to cut through her cries. I can't stand to be near you right now. She froze, her hands dropping to her sides, her eyes wide with shock and fear. I could see the realization dawning on her, the understanding that I wasn't bluffing, that I was really going to leave her. Where will you go? She whispered, her voice trembling. Does it matter? I replied coldly, heading towards the door. Anywhere but here. She stood there, watching me with a broken expression, as if she wanted to say something more, to beg me one last time, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me echoing through the quiet house like the final note in a tragic symphony. As I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a slap in the face, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the heated emotions that had been swirling inside me just moments ago. I walked to my car, my steps heavy, each one feeling like a nail being driven into the coffin of our marriage. I didn't look back as I got into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I started the engine. The house was just a silhouette in the rearview mirror, a dark, looming presence that I was desperate to escape. But as I drove away, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, suffocating me, until I had to pull over to the side of the road, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I sat there in the darkness, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The tears came then, hot and unbidden, spilling down my cheeks as the reality of what I'd done, of what we'd lost, finally hit me. I cried for the life we'd had, for the love we'd shared, for the future that had been stolen from us. I cried for the man I used to be, the man who had once believed in love and trust and forever. But most of all, I cried because, deep down, I knew there was no going back. No matter how much I wanted to, no matter how much I still loved her, the damage was done. The life we'd built together, the love we'd shared, it was all gone, shattered into a million pieces that could never be put back together. When the tears finally subsided, I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my eyes red and swollen, my throat raw from the sobs. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to gather what little strength I had left. I couldn't stay here, wallowing in the wreckage of my life. I had to keep moving, had to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I started the car again and pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I drove aimlessly, with no destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that house, couldn't go back to the life I'd known. Not now. Not ever. The miles blurred together as I drove, the night stretching out endlessly before me. I didn't know where I was going, or how long I'd keep driving. All I knew was that I had to get away from everything: Jenny, Tom, the memories, the pain. I had to get away from the life that had been destroyed, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to start over. But even as I drove, the pain still clung to me, a heavy weight that refused to let go. The road ahead was dark, uncertain, and I knew that whatever came next, it would be a long, hard journey. A journey that I wasn't sure I had the strength to face. But for now, all I could do was keep driving, keep moving forward, and hope that somewhere down the road, I'd find a way to heal, to rebuild, to live again. And maybe, just maybe, find a way to forgive, if not Jenny, then at least myself, for everything that had happened. But for tonight, all I had was the road, the darkness, and the bitter, unyielding pain of a love that had been lost forever. I don't remember how long I drove that night. The road ahead was a blur, the darkness stretching endlessly as I tried to outrun the thoughts chasing me. When the sky finally began to lighten, signaling the arrival of dawn, I found myself parked on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, the sound a distant roar that echoed the turmoil inside me. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the horizon, the sun slowly rising to cast its golden light over the water. I had no answers, no clear path forward. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, not to the life I'd known, not to the man I used to be. But I also knew that I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Eventually, I had to make a decision about what came next. And as much as it pained me, I knew that the first step in that process was confronting the reality of what had happened, of what my life had become. With a heavy heart, I reached for my phone, which had been lying untouched on the passenger seat since I left the house. I hesitated for a moment, dreading what I would find, but I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I unlocked the screen and saw several missed calls and text messages from Jenny. Most of them were variations of the same desperate plea: "Please come home. We can talk about this." But there were a few new ones as well, more frantic, as if she'd realized that I might not come back. "David, please, I'm begging you. Don't leave me. I can't lose you. Where are you? Please just tell me you're okay." I scrolled through the messages, each one tightening the knot in my chest. I knew she was scared, knew she was probably a wreck after everything that had happened. But that didn't change the fact that I couldn't face her. Not yet. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned on doing just yet: I called my lawyer. The phone rang twice before Marcia picked up, her voice sharp and professional despite the early hour. "David? What's going on?" "Marcia," I began, my voice hoarse from hours of silence. "I need to file for divorce." There was a brief pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her adjusting her glasses, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "I figured this might be coming," she said finally, her tone softening slightly. "I'm sorry, David. I know this isn't easy." "It's not," I agreed, swallowing the lump in my throat. "But it has to be done." "Do you want to talk about what happened?" she asked gently. "Or do you just want to get straight to business?" For a moment, I considered unloading everything on her: the betrayal, the fight, the revenge I'd taken on both Jenny and Tom. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Marcia was my lawyer, not my therapist. I had to stay focused on the task at hand. "Just business," I replied, my voice firm. "I'll need the paperwork drawn up as soon as possible." "Of course," she said, her tone all business now. "I'll start working on it right away. Do you want me to handle serving the papers, or would you prefer to do it yourself?" The thought of confronting Jenny with the divorce papers myself made my stomach churn. As much as I hated the idea of someone else doing it, I knew I didn't have the strength to face her again. Not now. "You handle it," I said quietly. "Just get it done." "I will," Marcia assured me. "And David, take care of yourself, okay? This is going to be a rough ride." "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks, Marcia." We ended the call, and I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. The life I'd known, the love I'd cherished, it was all over. All that was left was to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move on. But as much as I tried to focus on the future, my mind kept drifting back to the past, to the life I'd shared with Jenny. I couldn't shake the memories, the images of the good times we'd had together, the moments when everything had seemed perfect. How had it all gone so wrong? How had we ended up here, on opposite sides of a chasm that could never be bridged? I knew I needed help. The pain, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it was too much for me to handle on my own. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of everything that had happened. With a deep breath, I dialed another number, one I hadn't called in years. The phone rang for a long time, and I almost hung up, but then a familiar voice answered, groggy with sleep. "David? Is that you?" "Yeah, Mom, it's me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I need to talk to you." There was a pause, and I could hear her rustling in the background, probably sitting up in bed. "What's wrong, sweetheart? What's happened?" I didn't even know where to begin, so I just blurted it out. "Jenny's been cheating on me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, and then silence. I could picture my mother sitting there, her hand over her mouth in shock, trying to process what I'd just told her. "Oh, David. I'm so sorry." "I don't know what to do, Mom," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I'm filing for divorce, but I just don't know how to get through this." "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, her voice filled with the warmth and reassurance that only a mother could offer. "You deserve better than this, David. You deserve to be with someone who loves you, who respects you." "I thought she did," I whispered, the pain of that realization hitting me all over again. "I thought she was the one." "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know. But you'll get through this. You're strong, David. And you have me. You're not alone." Those words, simple as they were, brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. I hadn't realized just how much I needed to hear them, to know that someone was on my side, that someone still cared about me. "Thank you, Mom," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry I haven't been around more. I've been so wrapped up in everything, I didn't even see what was happening." "There's nothing to apologize for," she said gently. "You've always done what you thought was best for your family. But now it's time to take care of yourself. You deserve to be happy, David. Don't ever forget that." "I'll try," I promised, though I wasn't sure how much I believed it. Happiness seemed like such a distant concept now, something I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, the sun climbing higher in the sky, its warmth doing little to chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. I knew that filing for divorce was just the beginning. There would be meetings with lawyers, negotiations over assets, the division of our lives down the middle. And through it all, I'd have to keep seeing Jenny, keep dealing with the woman who had torn my heart out and stomped on it. I wasn't sure I had the strength for it. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just run away from this. I had to face it head on, no matter how much it hurt. But before I could go through with any of it, I needed to have one final conversation. Not with Jenny, I was done talking to her, but with Tom. I had hurt him, humiliated him, destroyed his life just as he had destroyed mine. But we were still brothers, and as much as I hated him right now, I couldn't let things end like this. I needed closure, for both of us. I made my way back into town, the drive passing in a blur. When I finally pulled up in front of Tom's apartment, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was going to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it had to be done. The door was unlocked when I reached it, and I let myself in. Tom was sitting on the couch, his face still bruised and swollen, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He didn't look up when I entered, just kept staring at the floor as if he were lost in some dark, unreachable place. "Tom," I said, my voice hoarse. He flinched at the sound of my voice but didn't respond. For a moment, I considered just walking out, leaving him to his misery. But I couldn't do it. As much as I hated what he had done, he was still my brother. We had grown up together, shared countless memories, both good and bad. I couldn't just abandon him now, no matter how much he deserved it. I walked over and sat down on the couch opposite him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, but I didn't know what to say. How do you start a conversation like this? How do you find the words to address the kind of betrayal that had shattered everything? "I'm sorry," Tom finally whispered, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. He still didn't look up, his gaze fixed on some invisible point on the floor. "I'm so fucking sorry, David." "Sorry?" I echoed, my voice laced with bitterness. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Tom. You fucked my wife. You destroyed my marriage. You destroyed our family." He winced at my words, his face crumpling as he let out a strangled sob. I know I did, and I'll never forgive myself for it." "Good," I snapped, the anger flaring up again. "Because I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you either." He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears, his expression one of complete and utter despair. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But I love you, David. You're my brother, and I don't know how to live with what I've done." For a moment, I just stared at him, the anger warring with the deep, aching sadness that had settled in my chest. He was right, I did hate him. But I also knew that hating him wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring back the life I'd lost, the love I'd cherished. And as much as I wanted to punish him, I knew that he was already punishing himself far more than I ever could. "I don't know how we move on from this, Tom," I said quietly, my voice filled with exhaustion. "But I know that we can't keep living like this. We have to find a way to get through this, somehow." He nodded, his tears falling freely now, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll do anything, David, just tell me what to do." "I don't know what to do either," I admitted, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "But I think we need some time apart. We need to figure out who we are without each other, without this mess." He nodded again, his sobs subsiding as he wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I understand," he whispered. "I'll give you space, as much as you need." I stood up, the conversation draining what little energy I had left. "I'm going to be filing for divorce," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "And I'm going to be moving away for a while. I need to get out of here, get away from all of this." Tom didn't argue, didn't try to convince me to stay. He just nodded, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I hope you can find some peace, David." "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I hope so too." With that, I turned and walked out of the apartment, the door closing behind me with a finality that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. As I made my way to my car, I knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead was long, and it was going to be painful. But for the first time since everything had happened, I felt a glimmer of hope, a small, flickering light in the darkness. And as I drove away from the town that had once been my home, I knew that whatever happened next, it was going to be on my terms. I was going to rebuild my life, piece by piece, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to heal. It's strange how the world keeps turning, how life goes on, even after everything you thought you knew is shattered. The sun still rises, the birds still sing, and people go about their lives as if nothing has changed. But for me, everything had changed. The life I had known was gone, torn apart by betrayal, leaving me to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. I left town the day after my conversation with Tom. There was nothing left for me there, nothing but painful memories and the ghosts of what once was. I didn't have a clear destination in mind, just a vague idea that I needed to get away, to find a place where I could breathe, where I could start over. The road stretched out before me, long and winding, taking me further and further from the life I had known. I drove for hours, days even, stopping only when I was too exhausted to continue. The small towns and cities blurred together, each one offering a temporary refuge as I tried to figure out what my next steps would be. Eventually, I found myself in a quiet coastal town, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower, where people still waved to each other on the street, and the ocean's constant presence brought a sense of calm. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself, where you could disappear and no one would ask too many questions. I rented a small cottage on the edge of town, tucked away behind a row of tall pine trees that blocked out the view of the road. The cottage was old, but well maintained, with a small porch that overlooked the ocean. It was the kind of place where you could sit and watch the waves for hours, letting the rhythm of the tide lull you into a sense of peace. I spent the first few weeks just existing, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. The divorce papers had been served, and Marcia assured me that everything was moving along as it should, but I couldn't bring myself to care about the legalities of it all. What mattered was that I was free from Jenny, from Tom, from the life that had been suffocating me. But freedom, I quickly realized, came with its own challenges. The anger that had fueled me, that had driven me to take revenge, was gone now, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I had spent so much time focused on what they had done to me that I hadn't allowed myself to fully process the loss, the grief that came with the end of a marriage, the end of a life I had built. Every morning, I would wake up early, the sky still dark, and make myself a cup of coffee. I would sit on the porch, watching as the sun slowly rose over the water, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a time for reflection, a time to think about everything that had happened, to try to make sense of it all. There were days when the pain was overwhelming, when I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I was drowning in the memories of what had been. But there were also days when I felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark that told me I could get through this, that I could rebuild my life, even if it would never be the same. I started going for long walks along the beach, the sound of the waves and the feel of the sand beneath my feet grounding me in a way that nothing else could. There was something healing about the ocean, about the vastness of it, the way it seemed to stretch on forever, reminding me that life, like the tide, would continue to ebb and flow, no matter what. The people in the town were kind, friendly in a way that didn't feel forced or superficial. They didn't pry, didn't ask too many questions, just accepted me as another person looking for a fresh start. It was what I needed, a place where I could be anonymous, where I could figure out who I was without the weight of my past hanging over me. One afternoon, while wandering through the small downtown area, I stumbled upon a bookstore. It was a quaint little place, tucked between a cafe and a flower shop, the kind of bookstore that smelled of old paper and had shelves that reached up to the ceiling, crammed with books of every genre. I spent hours in there, losing myself in the stacks, letting the words on the pages transport me to another world, another life. It was the first time in months that I felt something other than pain, something close to joy, or at least a sense of contentment. The owner of the bookstore, an older woman with a warm smile and a gentle demeanor, introduced herself as Helen. She noticed how often I came in, and one day, as I was browsing the shelves, she approached me with an offer I hadn't expected. "You seem to spend a lot of time in here," she said, her voice soft and kind. "How would you like a part-time job?" I looked at her, surprised. "A job?" She nodded. "Just a few hours a week. We could use the help, and you seem like the kind of person who loves books. It might be good for you, to have something to do." I hesitated for a moment, but something about her offer felt right. I wasn't ready to dive back into a full-time career, but the idea of spending my days surrounded by books, of helping others find stories that could offer them an escape, appealed to me in a way I hadn't expected. "Okay," I said, nodding slowly. "I'd like that." And so, I started working at the bookstore, just a few hours a day, shelving books, helping customers find what they were looking for. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself slowly starting to heal. The pain was still there, a dull ache that I carried with me, but it wasn't as sharp, as all-consuming as it had been. I was beginning to find pieces of myself that I had lost along the way, parts of me that had been buried under the weight of betrayal and anger. One day, while I was working at the bookstore, a woman came in, her arms full of books she wanted to donate. She was around my age, with a warm smile and kind eyes. We struck up a conversation as I helped her unload the boxes, talking about our favorite authors, the books that had changed our lives. Her name was Emily, and there was something about her that put me at ease, something that made me feel like I could be myself around her, without the fear of judgment or rejection. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we started meeting up for coffee, for walks along the beach, for dinners at the little cafe down the street. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, a connection, a friendship that was slowly blossoming into something more. She knew about my past, about the divorce, the betrayal, and she never pushed me to talk about it, never tried to fix me. She just listened, offering her support in quiet, unobtrusive ways that made me feel seen, understood. As the months went by, I found myself looking forward to our time together, to the way she made me laugh, the way she challenged me to think about things differently. She was helping me heal, not by filling the void that Jenny had left, but by helping me realize that there was still so much life to be lived, so much joy to be found, even after everything I had been through. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my cottage, watching the sun set over the ocean, she reached over and took my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me, a sign that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to carry the weight of my past by myself. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice filled with gratitude. She looked at me, her eyes soft and understanding. "For what?" "For being here," I replied. "For helping me find my way back to myself." She squeezed my hand gently, her smile warm and reassuring. "You're stronger than you think, David. You've been through hell, but you've come out the other side. And you're going to be okay." I believe that. For the first time in a long time, I believed it too. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but I knew that I wasn't facing it alone. I had found a new life, a new beginning, and while it wasn't the life I had once imagined, it was mine. And that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of twilight, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a peace that had been elusive for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready to face it, ready to embrace whatever came next. And as I sat there, holding Emily's hand, watching the last light of day fade into night, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had found something worth living for again. Something that made all the pain, all the heartbreak, all the loss, worth it. Because in the end, life goes on. And so would I.